Everybody, we're going to get started. If you're ready, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Lynn.
Great. Great, well, welcome. On behalf of the CaLP team, we're really happy to have such a great group of participants today, particularly at this time of year. And many of you have already engaged in the process so far. When we kicked off this process at Cash Week earlier this year, or actually it was late last year. And now we'd like to engage you further in the process. For those of you who are new or might have forgotten kind of where we're going, you might be asking why CaLP is doing this and what difference you think another report will make to the humanitarian system. What we found over the past year is that the scale up of cash is challenging a system that we know is ill-equipped in the face of protracted crises and climate change. As a CaLP member and as a network, we've all been leading up this change by focusing on outcomes rather than outputs, by advocating for response analysis processes that put people's needs first rather than agency mandates, to integrate and consider gender and protection meaningfully, to link to social protection systems for greater sustainability, as well as to address exclusion and address data protection tangibly and meaningfully. We've also recognized the need to work differently, and we're now seeing new operational models like the CCD and the UN Common Cash System emerging in recent months. Amidst this backdrop, we recognize the need to step back, better understand the major drivers of change and where they might take us, so that we can prepare now to ensure optimal outcomes for participants. So on to the objectives. Our objectives today and through the future financial assistance process is to support CaLP members to understand what future trends mean for opportunities to work differently and deliver better using new instruments and partnerships. We also want to support greater collaboration around an evolution of roles and approaches, as well as address the political hurdles to do so. And finally, we want to capitalize on our collective knowledge and experiences to help our members navigate this change process. And all of this with the aim of making sure that we have optimal outcomes for crisis-affected populations in the future. Now we're showing the results of the poll that most of you hopefully took that we launched at the beginning. We found actually surprisingly, we have a good number of optimists. 55% of you were somewhat positive, 12% very positive. And I guess combined, we have only 15% of the respondents were somewhat negative. So it's an interesting finding of kind of where you all, from where you all sit. So that's very positive. Since the beginning of the year, just to go over where we are in the process with the Future Financial Assistance Initiative, we've been conducting research with IARAN, ranging from key informant interviews to online surveys, many of which you were involved in. We've also done structured analysis to develop the scenarios that we'll be discussing today. This webinar, along with last week's workshop in Amman, will provide really important inputs for us to help finalize the first draft of the report. And the end product will be done this fall and disseminated for further discussions around strategic transformation. For us, the final report is not the end goal, but the beginning of a process of how CaLP can support its members to navigate change. To get us into the mindset for today's discussion, we'll now turn to Paula Gilbaizan, an independent expert with a good amount of expertise across many areas, including futures thinking, change management, and strategy development. We'll then follow with a presentation from Isabel Pelli with IARAN, who many of you know as well, who will walk us through the scenarios. And then we'll wrap it up with a quick summary from Nick Nichols, our new MENA regional representative, who will give a brief readout of the Amman workshop highlights. Paula, over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
I'll start my video as well. Does that work?
Yes.
So, hi everyone. I'm super glad that you've managed to join. I'm just going to give like a quick introduction. In general, we paint possible pictures of the future so that we can choose our preferred option and define what we need to change to build that future. So futures and foresight should be by force, active and interactive. Because when futures and foresight are passive and are mandated by someone else, we all lose. A future that is imposed is never a future that is owned. And as we can see from that comic that you have on your screens, a future that we own that we don't own can have disastrous consequences. If we don't own the vision of the future, we might not see that we're going to a bad place. We might not even know where that place is, regardless of how good the instructions other people gave us are. Futures that are not inclusive can end up hurting the people whose voices were excluded. So I really want you to focus on that today, because I imagine that you've made the time to join this webinar because you're interested in being part of the future of financial assistance. And you probably know that cash and markets are vital if we ever want to achieve long-lasting transformation for the vulnerable people we aim to serve. So being here today also makes you interested in the future of aid as a whole. So now that you're here, I'd like to encourage you to make the most of it, because owning this process matters. It matters not only to the organizations that you might work for, but most importantly, it matters for the people that we're aiming to serve. You might think that one or two voices don't matter, and it doesn't matter what you say in this webinar. It doesn't matter if you engage in feedback. But it is really very hard to ignore the collective. Turn on your TV and look at what's happening in different parts of the world. Ask the people who are planning to storm Area 51 in the coming months. Their motto is, "They can't stop us all." So I would encourage you to take inspiration from that and proactively participate. So I would like to give you a few pointers on how to engage in this discussion, not only for this webinar, but for all of the opportunities that CaLP will give you to talk about the future of financial assistance. So first of all, I would like to encourage you to question whether the future that you're building is the version of the future that vulnerable people can see themselves in. If vulnerable people cannot see themselves in those versions of the future, in those scenarios that we're building, then those scenarios are all only for our own self-fulfillment and perpetuation. If those scenarios are versions of the people of the future that people can see themselves as they really see themselves as empowered and capable, then we're going in the right direction. Perhaps the second pointer I'd like to give you is to use these conversations of the future to have a conversation of how will this allow you to define yourselves boldly around the change that you're trying to create. How is this conversation going to enable you to make unapologetic cases for investing in the pursuit of that change? Any conversation of the future that ends up in people flagging their mandate flags are not necessarily the best conversations. If you're encountering that, I would encourage you to be inspired by the force of the collective. And finally, then the last pointer I'd like to give you on how to engage in these conversations about the future is to remember that we are not only creating these scenarios of the future for ourselves, we're creating these scenarios for the next generation. So if we don't allow them to play an active role in planning and shaping our work, instead of just following on our footsteps, it's going to be really hard to achieve any degree of sustainability. So use these conversations to include other people that are young, that might be the interns in your organizations, that might be innovators working in startups, people that have the intention of joining the sector,
Thanks, Paula. Great, now we'll turn over to Isabel, who will walk us through the scenarios and drivers.
Hi, good morning all. Thanks so much, Lynn and Paula, for that inspiring start. And so that you can all engage as well as possible, what I'm going to do is talk through a little bit of the method that we as IARAN use for this research. Then give you a few framing considerations so you can understand what the scenarios are, but also what they're not. A snapshot of the driver files, and I believe you've seen maybe a slide on each as part of the pre-reading. And then I'm going to quickly go through each of the scenarios. And then this is going to be a lot to absorb in 20 minutes, but the idea is that you'll then be able to explore the scenarios in more depth in your breakout groups. So just to start and building on where Paula left off, futures thinking is a process through which we try and explore uncertainty and contemplate what may happen, but we're not certain.
Isabel, we lost your sound. Are you still there? Just one moment. Okay.
Hi, I'm very sorry about that.
Welcome back.
Sorry, I'm dialing in from Haiti and it's not always the best connection, but I'm hopeful that it should be okay now. So sorry, I was just saying that future thinking is a strategic thinking process that needs to be used and exploited to make decisions. And the way in which we try and narrow down those possible futures is by developing a series of scenarios. And you can see those as well featured in this cone. And so what I'm going to talk through next really is about how methodologically we got to those scenarios. So Lynn, if you could move to the next slide, please. Okay, so the method that we used at IARAN has been specifically adapted for the humanitarian sector, and it's the method that IARAN have used for a number of different pieces of foresight work. So the starting point was to map out what we mean by the financial assistance system. So all the different factors that could be part of that system. And we did that through what some of you might be familiar with as a PESTEL analysis. So we came up with about 30 or so factors. And that's obviously quite an overwhelming amount of information to digest. So in order to then structure the analysis, what we did is we mapped those scenarios against each other. And this was a process facilitated through CaLP and through, thanks to a number of you who are on the sounding board for this work. And we identified which are the most influential factors within this system. And that's how we came up with the 8 factors that you see here along the top of the screen, known as the Foresight base. And I'll touch on those a little bit more in a bit. And then for each of those factors, we came up with a range of hypotheses. And these hypotheses were typically mutually exclusive and sometimes quite extreme. Then what we did is we mapped these hypotheses onto the existing scenarios of the Future of Aid report, which IARAN published in late 2016. I think this is a really unique element of this work, which was already grounded in a very thorough process of foresight analysis and looking at generally how humanitarian assistance and need are going to evolve with a 2030 horizon. Based on these, with the future of aid scenarios and our future financial assistance hypotheses, we combine those to create the future of financial assistance scenarios that we'll be looking at today. And then for each of those scenarios, we've developed, and this was very much reinforced through our workshop in IARAN last week, we developed a series of possible considerations of opportunities and threats for end users, whilst recognizing that that's inevitably biased because it comes from our perspective, and also implications for the formal humanitarian sector. And those elements are what we're going to ask you to help us further refine today in the breakout groups. So if we move to the next slide, I'm now going to just go through a few framing considerations so that we're all on the same page before we get into the scenarios. So firstly, what do we mean by financial assistance? Is it different to cash assistance? Why are we talking about this broader term, etc.? I think as Lynn touched on earlier on, this is really a recognition of the fact that just looking at cash and voucher assistance within the humanitarian sphere is quite a limited way of looking at a tool which actually cuts across mandates, cuts across timeframes, and ultimately for the recipients pretty much looks the same. So we've defined financial assistance as all financial flows which reach vulnerable and crisis-affected people at individual or household level, and recognizing that can be provided through a range of mechanisms and a range of sources. And so on the screen there, you have a not necessarily exhaustive list of some of the different financial assistance instruments that, that we've considered in this analysis. So then the next slide, we're looking at what are some assumptions, what are some starting assumptions around financial assistance that we think cut across all scenarios and that hopefully all of us on this call can be comfortable around. The first is that financial assistance as a tool is a highly effective humanitarian and development intervention, and that there's great potential for further expansion of its use. We know the stats in terms of the increased use of cash and voucher assistance over the last decade or so, but there was a GPPI report published in 2016, I believe, that estimated that cash assistance could be up to 40% of humanitarian aid. So we know that there's still a lot of potential to be exploited, and that applies across financial assistance instruments. We also know that cash assistance will continue to catalyze change in the humanitarian sector. Whether or not that changes in everybody's interest is another question, but certainly it is stimulating change. We're assuming that funding for financial assistance overall, in absolute numbers, absolute terms, will continue to increase, but that the extent of the gap between needs and resources for financial assistance is unclear. And finally, another assumption we have is that the synergies between different financial assistance instruments provide opportunities to bridge the humanitarian development nexus. And that's, again, part of the reason why we're looking at all these instruments together. So moving on to the final sort of framing consideration. Now, these elements come out from our discussions in Amman, and this was so helpful to be able to get some initial feedback from participants to sort of think, what are these scenarios, what are they not? So just a few thoughts. So firstly, the scenarios may already reflect today's reality. And perhaps when you're engaging with them later, it might be helpful for you to think about what context they remind you of. And that certainly happened with our Middle Eastern group last week. These scenarios aren't standalone. They can coexist within a given region or even within a large country. And they're a potential reality in developed countries too, especially with what we see in terms of political trends and the evolution of governance in developed countries. You'll see when we get into the scenarios that many of those might resonate there as well. Obviously, financial assistance should not be viewed in isolation. We're looking through the financial assistance lens here, but the effectiveness of it as a tool depends on what else is happening around it, and that's certainly something to consider. We're not assuming that financial assistance levels are higher in one scenario than another, but what might influence the access and quality of financial assistance between the different scenarios will be issues around inclusion and exclusion of different end users, how the assistance is coordinated, and how effectively it's designed. So those are some of the big divergences that you'll see between scenarios. And then finally, each scenario considers the role of end users, as hopefully as actively as possible, the role of the formal humanitarian and development sector, of local actors, of national governments, and of the private sector. And just so maybe something to underline here as well is that the target audience for this work, as Lynn alluded to earlier on, is the formal humanitarian sector. So you might find that the scenarios are written slightly from that lens, and that is somewhat intentional, although then when we look at the opportunities and threats for recipients, then that really encourages us to think from that perspective, as Paola encouraged us. So now just to give you a quick snapshot of the driver files. So next slide, please, and thank you. So these are, in the final report, each driver file is about 3 or 4 pages, very rich, and each will cover sort of definitions of what that, what that driver is about, why it's important to financial assistance, what are some of the key uncertainties with the 2030 scenario around that driver, and what are some controversies and debates. So you can see them on the left-hand side. I'm not going to read through them, but just to reiterate, those were selected based on this mapping of which factors are most influential on each other, and so these are they're fundamental to how financial assistance will evolve. And in addition to those to those 8 driver files, the report also contains 4 sort of cross-cutting text boxes which apply across, or which have relevance across the different driver files. And those are on Libra, the new Facebook-led cryptocurrency. They're on distributed ledger technology and its different uses for financial assistance. There's one on innovative financing mechanisms and their implications for financial assistance. And then there's one looking at Aadhaar and the India Stack, which is the integrated ID management system in India, as an example of what a government-led system like that can look like and the implications. So we don't have time now to go into each driver file. And as I said, hopefully you've received those slides in advance. But just to touch on 4 overarching themes that can be drawn out from all the driver files. So the first one is who will be involved in the delivery of financial assistance. And some key points there are the overarching role of the ubiquitous role rather of the private sector across a whole range of different functions and really across all 4 scenarios. Also the role of government, which can have either a positive influence or a negative influence on access and quality of financial assistance. And then touching on both of those is regulation related to financial services, to internet access, to ID, data protection, and so on. And again, depending on the level of regulation and the level of competition for private sector actors, that can be a positive or a negative thing. So those are some of the key factors we look at there. The second overarching theme is what will the modalities of financial assistance be and what do they rely on? And this is where we touch on the different instruments of financial assistance, how the private sector will be enabling those. That includes, for example, through cryptocurrency, but also how, also questions of access to financial assistance and in particular to financial services, and this notion of a digital divide, which we see emerging across many of the scenarios. And then obviously data, I mean, it's probably the most used word in this report, data being absolutely central to how we analyze, design, improve financial assistance, but then big questions around who holds that data and who uses it. Third theme is how end users will be identified and the power that they have over their own data. So here we have questions around, again, access to financial assistance and the linkages with financial inclusion. Questions, especially when we're talking about refugees, around legal identity and know your customer requirements. Digital ID and whether this is a can be a positive thing, or what are some of the challenges, and then the risks to beneficiary data across all of those issues. And then finally, another overarching theme is how will financial assistance be funded? So we look at the role of traditional donors and seeing how financial assistance might evolve and the new instruments they might use. We also look at the role of the private sector, including as a direct donor. The evolution of direct giving, so peer-to-peer, but also remittances. And then an emerging area, which is the synergies between financial assistance and anticipatory action. This is literally just a whistle-stop tour, but should give you a little bit of a taster. So finally, we're going to go into the scenarios. So as I mentioned before, the scenarios are grounded in the scenarios of the Future of Aid report. And those, the Future of Aid report developed 4 scenarios which can be mapped along these 2 major axes, one of which is related to governance and one of which is related to the nature of crises. I'm not going to go into that now, but I'm going to touch on each scenario as I go through the slides on the financial assistance scenarios. So starting with the Narrowgate. So in the Future of Aid, the Narrowgate is characterized by the rise of nationalism, a decline in the relevance of global governance institutions, and a politicization of crises, especially in fragile states. And so what do we think that means from a financial assistance point of view? We think that means that governments will seek to control who has access to financial assistance and who can provide it. So really limiting the role of international actors. Whether or not that's a good thing is up to you to debate. That governments will have a monopoly over financial assistance provision, but not necessarily sufficient resources to cover needs. And that typically in this context of high government control, that assistance will be coordinated through single accounts. Again, there are benefits and challenges to that. That there might be some external funding for social transfers in particular, but that will be highly controlled. That internet access will be expanded through mobile technology in particular, but governments will control content and services. In this scenario, we would see official ID integrated with other ID credentials, so in a sort of Aadhaar India Stack model, for example. And perhaps as a result, very limited recipient control over personal data. And we anticipate that refugees and minority groups will be isolated with no access to financial assistance, or very limited access. So that's a snapshot of the Narrowgate. Lots to digest, but as I say, you can go more into it when you work through the breakout groups. So the next scenario is the overflow. And in this one, in the Future of Aid report, what's anticipated is a withdrawal of global governance. So that's those factors, that idea of the withdrawal of global governance applies to the Narrowgate as well. An increase in sovereignty and transnational or so-called ecosystemic crises, which create a dramatic escalation in need and a really large gap between needs and capacity to respond. So this is really a chaotic scenario. In this context, we anticipate that these complex systemic crises will require cross-border and multi-actor approaches to financial assistance. But at the same time, with the resurgence of sovereignty, withdrawal of global governance, that financial assistance will be vulnerable to rising anti-aid sentiment. And so perhaps as a result, traditional donors will prioritize humanitarian assistance for rapid onset crises rather than support to more complex, protracted crises. That as governments will be overwhelmed, they'll have limited regulatory capacity to enable financial assistance. Without control over that, that will really limit financial service options and other enablers, for example, technological enablers of financial assistance. Financial assistance will likely be used to achieve exclusionary aims, particularly for minority or persecuted groups, as well as refugees. And then the complexity of actors and the complexity of needs will lead to multiple ID systems across borders, which will likely result in significant data protection risks. And although data will be generated across all these different players, it's unlikely to be used smartly or in a principled way. Because of this chaos, it's probably likely that there'll also be an increase in the flow of remittances, but given the lack of regulation, that transfers will be costly. So not a particularly exciting prospect. Moving then to each to their own playing field. So this one again is about protracted crises and a multiplicity of actors, but we do see the emergence of a new form of governance, so new networks evolving, for example, around particular thematics, particular sectoral expertise, and by that we mean, sectors or issues that might bridge private sector and humanitarian and development interests. Megacities and other sort of non-state structures playing an increasing role, and a very fractured humanitarian system. So in terms of financial assistance, that means that these new networks will play a greater role in financial assistance, and that can be certainly a very positive thing, but it's unlikely to be governed by any common principles or standards. That there'll be localized, uncoordinated solutions in areas of strategic interest for these players, but rather than being based on need. That more and more functions and services will be outsourced to the private sector, and in particular that there'll be a major influence of technology players, which is likely to increase the digital divide because those investments will likely be, again, in areas of strategic interest. That we might see blockchain being quite prevalent, but because of the lack of coordination, there'll be real challenges around interoperability of these systems. And similarly, that disjointed ID systems will create disparity in access to financial assistance and increase vulnerabilities for end users. We might see new funding sources, including peer-to-peer giving within given contexts, and we're also likely to see divergent treatment of refugees and migrants. So this is a really disjointed approach, but at the same time, some new networks developing that could be exploited. And then finally, revolutions. Now within this, we see a new and diverse system of governance, which is self-regulating and gradually leads to an institutionalization of interactions between different players. And that supersedes global governance. So it's really about a new paradigm, which ideally is based on inclusivity and much greater focus on user-centered response. So this is unlikely to happen before at least 2025 and represents a very significant shift from the status quo. So what might this mean? This could mean collaborative design, funding, and delivery of financial assistance across a multitude of players and actively enabled by local civil society. Ideally, it also means enabling national and global regulation, strong partnerships, and effective transnational coordination structures that facilitate financial assistance. That there'll be clear mechanisms for supporting social transfers, so the roles and responsibilities of, or the potential added value of different players in social transfers is clear. That partnerships between the private sector and traditional humanitarian actors are based on standards, and that these standards also inform common global ID standards and the use of blockchain, which are based on national and transnational interoperability, or allow national and transnational interoperability. The fact that these systems are quite joined up may also increase their vulnerability to attacks. So that's certainly something to consider. And finally, in this scenario, we see a diversity of funding sources for financial assistance, including taxation, remittances, and peer-to-peer giving. So I'm going to stop there. I know that was a lot to absorb, and I'll hand back over to Lynn, but looking forward to engaging with you all on these scenarios.
Great, thank you, Isabel, for giving us a good whistle-stop tour across all the work that you've been doing alongside CaLP colleagues. Next, we'll turn over to Nick Nicholas, who's just joined as of perhaps a couple weeks ago, max, to our Amman office as the MENA regional rep. Over to you, Nick.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Lynn said, the FFA event in Amman was in my at the end of my first week, my second week with CaLP here in the Middle East. And so I'm going to just run through a couple of things that we took away from that event. And I think to follow on from the scenarios that you've just heard Isabel take you through, we were very heavily represented by people from the Middle East within the workshop here in Oman. And that meant we had quite a Middle East lens, quite a conflict-focused lens applied to the scenarios. I mean, that's something that we were aware of, that we kind of accounted for, and part of today and part of other parts of this review process is also validating the scenarios through other lenses. So if you take into consideration other contexts that you've operated in when we go into the breakout sessions, that would be great. A couple of the big things that I guess we took away from that is that the workshop in Oman was that the landscape is changing. And while this is all very theoretical and we base this on a kind of long distance future, the landscape is changing. It's changing as we work today, and that if we don't adapt over time, we're going to get left behind. And you'll see that in a lot of these scenarios, that the role of us as actors changes significantly in each one of them. One of the key points about that, and something that was discussed a lot, was the role of both the private sector and the role of technology. We had conversations ranging from Libra to the use of artificial intelligence, and the role of companies like MasterCard in how we operate. I think one of the things that was very interesting was that there was a general sense of positivity about the role of technology, but there was much less of a sense of positivity about the role of the private sector, which is something that I think poses an interesting question, because you can't have one without the other. And so it's something to bear in mind when you're looking at the role of blockchain, or you're looking at the role of big tech within your scenario, is how do you view those actors interacting within the humanitarian space, knowing that we can't really have one without the other. Within the group today, half of us will be looking at this from a recipient's perspective. It was a big takeaway from Oman that people felt that there had to be a bigger focus within these scenarios of what this means for recipients. And so we will ask you some questions in that about how you think this would affect the recipient. The big thing that I think we took away from that was that there was a general perception that we forget that trust is one of the biggest issues facing recipients, that they're less bothered about who or how or why they're receiving assistance, but they want to have a sense of trust in their ability to access that assistance. And that has a big influence if we look at some of these scenarios and you've got changing players, that may mean a lot to us, but it may mean less to the people that we're there to serve. Finally, just 2 points about, and keep these in mind when we go into these breakout groups, is that we found that even though we're trying to theorize about the future, once we split into groups, we found very quickly people reverted back into their boxes, into their day-to-day ways of working. And it was very hard to get people to take those blinkers off. And so to put that into, we talk about, a never-ending change in the political situation of the world, or the climate crisis that exists. And we don't know a lot of what's going to happen in the coming future. But that's all the more reason for us to look at different ways of working and different models of working. And that's part of what this process is about how can we work in different ways and what will our role be in the future, which has a different landscape to it. And the final point we'll make is, and we had this discussion right at the end of the workshop, was about the concept of learning. Now, this process is all about us learning from each other. And I think one of the things that we spoke about was that for learning to be effective, it has to be honest. And we have to learn from each other's mistakes, and we have to be honest to talk about those things that sometimes we perceive as being negative and we don't like to share so much. We like to talk about the positive things we learned about and how we've made things better, but we don't like to reflect too much on how we've found things difficult. And if we're going to look at these scenarios, I think there's a lot of difficult questions to be asked about people's roles, about people's places. And so think about that when you're analysing the various scenarios, and try and be as open and honest as you possibly can. And with that, I will pass back over to Lynn.
Great, thanks, Nick. So now we're going to move over to breakout groups, and they'll be facilitated by one of the CaLP staff members who can help answer any questions, and I'm sure there'll be a very active discussion. So we're gonna move you into these groups in a moment. You'll have about 20 minutes. And so once this starts up, a pop-up box will show up. So just click Join Breakout Group. Over to you. Enjoy. Great, I see lots of smiling faces. So I hope you had rich discussion. Certainly I heard some very active ones. So can we go over to our group leads to provide one highlight from their discussion? So first we'll start with Stefan on the Narrowgate scenario, our quite doom and gloom scenario.
Only one highlight. That's a difficult one because there were many highlights in our group. So basically, there was a feedback that that's from someone just coming back from India and someone else working in East Africa, that these scenarios are really not too far away, and some of this is happening already. And maybe the main point, I guess, which was also resonating, is that if this scenario really happens, which would lead to even a bigger marginalization of refugees and minorities in that sense, or excluded people, that would be a massive problem because that's basically our mandate, and that's the people we are here to serve. Having the government, which has the monopoly over financial assistance and humanitarian assistance in general, leads to a big risk of fraud and corruption, or a potential risk of fraud and corruption, and a potential lack of accountability. This is one highlight, I guess. It's not a highlight, it's a very negative highlight. But if I have to keep short, then that's what I want to say.
Great. Okay, thanks, Stefan. Now we'll go over to each their playing field with Nick.
So to each their playing field sees us in quite a fractured world with a significant rise in the use of technology across that fractured scenario. And so I think the biggest takeaway in it is that it doesn't have to be viewed in a negative way, and that actually if we can harness the power of technology in a fractured society, we could get ourselves to a place where we're more customer driven, and the quality of our services are kind of dictated by our interactions with recipients. I think that was the biggest thing I took away from our group.
Great. And then over to Karen. Actually, Karen, I think you combined with Nick. So how about the overflow scenario? Rose and Tegan.
Hi everyone, that's us. One of the main points was there'll be a need or an opportunity for collective action between humanitarian actors in our scenario to be pushing governments specifically to be changing their policies or pushing for a better regulatory environment to be able to do CBA with less global governance. That would be a real need. And then another tension that we talked about, just to stick to two highlights, would be what if there's a reluctance from beneficiaries to be involved in any programs if their data is not secure. So they may not want to know their country of origin or the country that they are moving to know that they're there if their movement is deemed illegal. Those are our main two highlights.
Great, thanks. And then over to Isabel, who they discussed more on the implications for the humanitarian sector for the overflow scenario.
Hello, everyone. So actually very aligned with Tegan and Rose's group. So we acknowledge that the formal humanitarian sector is reliant on the rules and regulations of host governments, and so we have a responsibility to engage with them meaningfully. And in order to do that, we can be more proactive and do that, prior to the escalation of a crisis, and especially when we're talking about these types of protracted transnational crises. They don't emerge overnight, so where we need to be better at our foresight in terms of anticipating these crises. And then maybe one enabler of that would be to have more of a common language between the range of different external actors, so not just the formal humanitarian actors, but in particular also the private sector, to be able to influence governments, and especially when we're talking about cross-border assistance and, say, using common financial services across borders. So yeah, those were some of our highlights. Thanks.
Great. Okay, thanks, Isabel. And then over to our revolution scenario, our, I guess, kind of ideal scenario. Julie and her group looked at the implications for recipients.
Hi, yes. So 2 quick points. And our conversation was very focused on the fact that, the countries which are currently experiencing humanitarian or development crises are very varied. And even within one country, there is massive variation. And this means that there will be those who at the moment have very limited understanding and no trust of digital systems, and we'll have to go out of our way to draw them into this very integrated world, which in principle involves a great deal of collaboration and engagement and participation. It's not going to be easy in remote parts of Malawi or in the north of Kenya. And the second point was that although governments are mentioned in this scenario, they really have a more limited role than one would expect if we're respecting national actors, and that we need to be engaging with governments and strengthening governments. I think those are the 2 main points that came out. I mean, it was a very nice scenario where the world would like to see, but even within that, there are challenges.
Thanks. And finally, over to Anna for the implications for the humanitarian sector from this idealistic scenario.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. So firstly, overall reflection from the group that the level of optimism for this scenario was high, mid to high, that although it was felt that it is the timeline suggested in the scenario that Isabel outlined of 2025, 2030 is unlikely. Also, the group felt it was unlikely that some elements of the scenario would organically emerge, such as global ID standards, for example, and that with this there'll be a strong need for global leadership to make sure this can come about. And then more specifically in terms of what it means for the humanitarian sector, it was unanimous that it does mean that we have to, the sector has to reinvent itself, and that with the models that we're seeing already, such as the UN Common Cash System, where there's direct delivery basically going elsewhere away from humanitarian players, then what is our role? What is the, is it coordination, or is it coordination plus a strong advocacy and watchdog role? So this was a watchdog role to make sure that these standards, be it in ID or any other area, that they can actually be adhered to. Thank you.
Great. When you came out of the breakout groups, you saw that there was a poll about how you felt about our ability to change and make the necessary adaptations. I would say maybe compared to the first question, here's where we feel maybe a little bit less positive, but potentially that was also colored by our discussions from the scenarios. I just wanted to also open it up. Does anyone else have additional reflections from their groups? Maybe that wasn't covered, or something you'd like to add? I know we haven't created the time for Q&A, but we didn't get any many questions in the chat either. Yes, I see a hand from Diane.
Yeah, hi. Just a quick thought. I'm very concerned about this digital ID thing and the government implication, mainly because a lot of these countries have an underbelly economy. And so the anonymity or the neutrality that we're seeking to achieve is also something that could enable people with less good intent to operate in countries. So it's complicated. It just hasn't been mentioned that it's really quite a complicated thing, that financial institutions are heavily regulated for a reason, and the transparency about who's getting what is for a reason. And so we have that barrier to overcome in what we're doing. Is that clear? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point that's come out also in the Amman workshops and throughout this exercise.
Can I add just one thing on that? Is that one of the things we actually did speak about in Amman is that cryptocurrencies are effectively the only other anonymous form of financial transaction that still exists beyond cash. And so there is potential for us to look to be able to harness the power of that, to allow people to keep that anonymity outside of existing structures, if we can do it in the right way. Now that's going to be the challenge.
Yeah, I guess we're not all signing up to Libra immediately.
For me, just quickly, just a general reflection on my side, that I feel like all the scenarios, and Nick mentioned that, yes, they were sort of like, it is biased in conflict sort of countries. So we seem to be talking a lot about displacements and people moving borders and complex scenarios. But I was just wondering if we've taken into consideration just cases of, I don't know, chronic poverty, which in our work we're dealing a lot with, and people in remote rural areas which may not have access exactly to all of those technological innovations, and this has all been addressed in the scenario. But so I know you say you're conscious that this was sort of like biased towards like Middle East conflict scenarios and displacement and huge migration, but just from a general perspective of just like rural chronic poverty, just general from my side.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Isabel, is there something you'd like to add on that?
No, thank you. Thanks very much for that. I think when we defined the financial assistance system, what we were talking about is both chronically vulnerable people as well as people affected by humanitarian crises, recognizing obviously that fluctuates. And I think especially when we're looking at the range of funding instruments that cut across those different needs, then we need to recognize both. And it's implicit, but I think we can make it more explicit. And so thanks for that reminder.
Great. Okay. I don't see any other hands, so I think we'll just go to wrap up now. So thank you all for your participation today. It was great. I'm really glad to hear a lot of the active discussions, and our trial of doing this online also worked out decently. And so thanks also to all the CaLP team who supported. I see some of the main takeaways from this discussion is, again, we need to really look beyond our current silos. It's really hasn't been enough. We need to work much more closely with the private sector. Unfortunately, we did have some RSVPs from the private sector, but I don't think any of them actually came. But we need to be working much more closely with them, as well as with the government. And we need to look at humanitarian assistance beyond just cash and vouchers. We also need to look at them alongside social protection systems, financial inclusion services, remittances. So we need to think big. I think another point that Diane, I'm sorry, just highlighted is that we need to really recognize what we don't know, and bring in the right people and with the right approach to tackle them. So that kind of goes back to the point of we need to widen the umbrella and figure out better ways of working with these new actors, especially when it comes to technology. I'm speaking for myself, but I'm often out of my depth in understanding what cryptocurrencies and blockchain really is. And I think we also re-emphasize too from the Amman discussion that need for trust. So it is trust between recipients and whoever's delivering assistance. It's trust in systems and understanding what those systems are. And also I think we need greater trust amongst one another. Even though we kind of lump ourselves as humanitarians, we do know that there's that competitive spirit that keeps us from collaborating more and more effectively. So I think on that note, I'd like to wrap up. In terms of next steps, we will be doing a review of the report over the next few weeks, I believe for the rest of August. If there's interest in, if you have special expertise in one of those drivers that Isabel discussed, we'd love to have your inputs to review those sections as well. So please do email me for more. And with that, we'll be kicking off this process later on this year. Again, this is just the start of finalizing the report, but it's really much more about the process of discussing with all of your organizations about what this means and what changes we can bring about, both internally and collectively as a network. So thank you all, and hope you have a good rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you very much, everyone.